My guest today is a cinema historian and prolific author with books covering the portrayal of scientists in film, anti-Chinese propaganda, classic horror, westerns, and the history of vampires in literature and film, just to name a few. He spent 5 years as chairman of the Arts Council England, has a slew of academic credits and qualifications to his name, at least one building named after him, and to top it all off, he's a knight. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome Sir Christopher Frayling. Hello, Sir Christopher.
Hello there. At least one building, eh? Yeah, just the one, I'm afraid.
Just the one so far.
Just the one so far. That's it. I still get a buzz walking past it, you know, and I sort of pretend not to notice the name on the building. And somebody looks at it and says, "Is he your grandfather?" "No, it's me."
Well, let's hop right into it because we have a lot to talk about. You wrote a book called Once Upon a Time in the West about the movie of the same name, and Quentin Tarantino wrote the foreword. And I just want to cherry pick a few of his comments here. Here are some of the things that he wrote. "The movie that made me consider filmmaking is Once Upon a Time in the West. It was almost like a film school in a movie. The way we cut to music now, you pick some rock song and you cut your scene to that song. That all started with Sergio Leone and Ennio Morricone, who affected my films in every way, shape, and form. I've always said that Pulp Fiction was a modern-day spaghetti western." So there's a lot to process there, but let's start with one of my favorite composers, Ennio Morricone, who sadly passed away earlier this year. Talk to us about how the collaborative process between the two started with Leone making movies that Morricone would then add music to, and the eventual shift to Morricone writing music that Leone would then direct his movies to.
Yeah. Well, with the first Western, A Fistful of Dollars, it was a commission, a straightforward commission, but Leone went round to see Morricone as his preferred composer, and they discovered they'd been to primary school together in the 1930s, although they didn't remember each other very well. So they'd actually known each other for quite a long time. But in the first film, the film was shot and the music was put on afterwards. With the second film, they thought, wouldn't it be interesting to start actually producing a score before the movie is shot and to to shoot the movie to the music, play it on the set. Remember, these are international films with lots of different languages being spoken, but the international language could be music. And so for the last 20 minutes of The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, the music was written in advance, but wasn't played on the set. You know, I asked Eli Wallach and Clint Eastwood, but neither of them remember it being played on the set. But by the time of Once Upon a Time in the West, 1967, they decided to write the entire score in advance, and it was played on the set through a PA system. They wired up the speakers, and the more emotional scenes were all played with the music playing. Remember that the Italians post-synchronized their movies so that the sound is laid afterwards, so you could actually play the music during a take, and nobody would know because you then post-synchronize everything else. So yeah, by then, the relationship was very, very close between them, where Morricone would play the theme on the piano or hum it to Leone, and they'd talk through the story and work out where the music fitted with which characters and which part of the story and so on. And, you know, the film history books talk about Bernard Herrmann and Alfred Hitchcock and, Williams and Spielberg, Nino Rota and Fellini, or John Barry and the early James Bond films. But I don't know of any relationship between director and composer that was quite as close as the relationship between Leone and Morricone. Certainly after the first movie, they absolutely were in sync with one another. Leone is not particularly musical, but he had a very, very strong sensitivity to sound, and he knew exactly what he liked. So yeah, it was an extraordinary working relationship, I think.
Yeah, that was a very special partnership they had, and it's an interesting point you raise about the synchronization, because to get distribution in different countries, they would have maybe a German leading man, a Spanish leading lady, a British villain, and everyone would just speak whatever language they knew, and it would all get sorted out in the dubbing.
Yeah, there's a movie called Day for Night, La Nuit Américaine by Truffaut, about the shooting of a movie. And there's an Italian actress called Valentina Cortesi, and she keeps blowing her lines. And the director says, "Come on, can't you get your lines right?" She said, "I prefer working with Federico Fellini. I just do numbers. 1, 2, 3, afterwards."
So with Morricone, he really established this signature sound for the spaghetti western. He had unusual instruments like anvils and whips, echolalic singing, operatic elements. It was just so unusual. And I think you can go anywhere in the world and do your worst impression of that signature theme from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and people will just immediately understand the reference.
Absolutely.
I was in Iran last year, and one of the few things that I played on the car stereo that my host immediately recognized with great delight was the score from that film. So I'm wondering, after the success of the Dollars trilogy, did Hollywood composers try to emulate Morricone, particularly in Western films, or was he kind of viewed as an outlier at the time?
A bit of an outlier. There was a brief moment, 69, 70, when, for example, if you see the film Hang 'em High, the Clint Eastwood, but the first Western he made back in America after the Italian Westerns, where Dominic Frontier, the composer, has a heavily amplified electric guitar and tries to get a kind of Morricone feel to it. So there's a kind of moment in the Western from the late 60s to the early 70s. But basically, he's treated as an outlier. He doesn't get an honorary Oscar till 2007. I personally think he was robbed on 2 occasions at least. The 2 occasions being Days of Heaven and The Mission, which was written in 1986. So it'd be the Oscars in 87, and particularly The Mission, because the Oscar that year went to Round Midnight. Great movie, but the music wasn't written specially for the movie. It used a lot of jazz standards that were rebooted for that film. And Morricone always felt a bit sore about that, because I think The Mission is an absolutely magnificent score. So it really wasn't till 2007, and then, of course, The Hateful Eight, just in time. Now, it's great that he got the Oscar for that. I don't think it was his best score, to be honest with you. And it also used various bits from The Exorcist #2 and other films of his. So it was about 20 minutes of new music. So it was slightly eccentric that he should get. It's great that he got it and that there was that acknowledgement at last. But I think it took a long time, actually, for the Academy to recognize his genius.
Yeah, that was certainly long overdue. I think everybody but them had figured it out by that point. So. Yeah. So they're both of them, Morricone and Leone. They're just hugely influential on new generations of composers and directors. But I was just so fascinated to hear that it was just one of their collaborations, that one movie that pushed Tarantino, one of the greatest filmmakers of his era, into the movie business.
Yeah.
By the end of his run, Morricone had written more mainstream scores than anybody else, and he wrote all of them by hand. So aside from Quentin, who are the most notable people that you feel have followed in Morricone and Leone's respective footsteps?
Well, I think you could write a graph, really, that first of all, the so-called movie brat generation, Spielberg, Lucas, Carpenter, Milius, have enormous respect for Once Upon a Time in the West and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And you can see the opening moment of Close Encounters, the dust, the long coat of the airman. Leone said to me when he went to see Close Encounters and saw that opening and the chord on the soundtrack, as you see this guy coming out of the dust, he said, "This film is made by Sergio Leone." So the first generation, and they studied him at film school. And although Once Upon a Time in the West hadn't been a huge commercial hit, it made its way into film culture, I think, through film colleges in the 1960s. So that's the first lot. Then you get sort of Rodriguez and Tarantino more recently. And as Tarantino said, all the jukebox movies that are made around your favorite rock music or your favorite surf music or whatever it is, right up to Baby Driver last year, they all bear the stamp of the relationship between music and image that you get in Morricone and Leone. But my favorite example is perhaps the most surprising, and that's Stanley Kubrick, for two reasons. One, as Morricone told me, he was actually offered A Clockwork Orange, but turned it down. He felt that there was going to be too much music by other composers, and he never liked sharing the credit with famous composers being reworked. But more importantly, if you watch Barry Lyndon, the most important scene and the most memorable scene in the movie is the duel, between Barry and Lord Bullingdon inside a disused barn with, the sun coming in through the windows and the doves flying, and you get all the ritual of charging the guns, and you may now start walking, and you may now turn around and fire, all the rituals of dueling. And then I read Barry Lyndon by Thackeray, the novel, and there's no duel in it. That was added for the movie, and it was added for the movie at a time when Kubrick was corresponding with Leone about Once Upon a Time in the West. Kubrick got in touch with Leone and said, how did you get that complete integration of music and image in Once Upon a Time in the West? There's moments in that film where they're so close. For example, when Claudia Cardinale arrives at the station and the crane goes up over the station building, and you see the town of Flagstone behind it, where the crescendo in the music is exactly matched by the rising of the crane. And Leone wrote back and said, it's quite simple. You write the music in advance. You write the music in advance and you cut the movie to the music. You don't do the normal thing, which is send a rough cut to the composer and get them to do the score afterwards. Then Kubrick went off and made Barry Lyndon, and he had chosen the various tracks. Handel's Saraband, do you remember, that gets played throughout the film, which is in a slowed down version, is played during the duel. I am convinced that the duel scene in Barry Lyndon is Kubrick's homage to Once Upon a Time in the West. So before the movie brats, before the Rodriguez and Tarantino generation, before Baby Driver, right a year or two later, after Once Upon a Time in the West, possibly the greatest homage to Leone and Morricone is the duel scene in Barry Lyndon.
And that's some pretty big names that you mentioned there. So,
yep. People say the duel scene in Barry Lyndon is their favorite duel, even better than The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Well, you say, well, yeah, okay, but there's a relationship between them.
And there's no better duel scene than The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. But
quite right,
everyone's entitled to be wrong, I suppose, if they want to be.
We'll forgive them.
So, speaking of that duel scene, there's some really great music during it and before it. You have alternately cited the Trio and the Ecstasy of Gold as your favorite Morricone pieces. The former is the glorious and sweepingly grand 7 minutes that accompanies the climactic three-way standoff at the end of the movie. And Ecstasy is the one that immediately precedes it in the film, while Tuco is running through the cemetery searching for the grave of Arch Stanton. Yeah. And that song has also been covered by Metallica during their concerts for many years. And as we speak, there's a slightly remixed version of it by Bandini, which is the centerpiece of Modelo's current TV ad campaign. So I'll put you on the spot and ask you once and for all, which is your favorite piece? But I also would like you to weigh in on what it is about Morricone's music that makes it so timeless and relevant that it's being used in ad campaigns even today.
Yeah, it's interesting because the answer to your question is I think the Ecstasy of Gold, that 3 minutes and 20 seconds of Tuco running around Sad Hill Cemetery trying to find the grave, for me is the high point. And in fact, I said to Ennio once, because he's not always rated Leone too highly in interviews, but I was slightly apprehensive, and I said, "What do you think?" He said, "Yeah, I must admit that got me into the film history books. I love it because of the integration of music and image, the synchronization of the music and the image, the way it builds up. There's some musical gags. You've got whack whack, as if there's ghosts watching this as he's going round and round, and sounds mixed in with it, as you always get with Leone. There's a program on British radio that's been running for many, many years called Desert Island Discs, which is all about if you were stranded on a desert island, what music would you take with you? Well,
that's where I got your line about the Trio, because you cited the Trio in Desert Island Discs.
Yeah, it's
you
true.
mentioned it by the Italian name, so I had to translate. Oh, the trio. Okay.
Yeah, I'm afraid so. But
time to get him to pick one.
Now I would take to the desert island the Ecstasy of Gold, and it's. I mean, what's special about it? It's. I mean, I can imagine the cameraman Tonino Delicoli. You know, he stuck a stick in the middle of the ground and put three cameras with 3 lenses on them on this stick and pointed them all in the same direction, and just got Eli Wallach to run round and round and round. And they, in their mind, they had the music already written, and then they moved the cameras a bit and so on. So you get that extraordinary synchronization of it. It seems very crude now. There'd be much more sophisticated ways of doing it, but they kind of improvised the idea. So, you know, you really get this guy is desperate to find this grave. He's running around in circles. He's dizzy, and it builds up and it builds up and it builds up. No, for me, it is a fantastic piece of music. And it's kind of indelibly associated with the images. So what's surprising is that, as you say, the music has survived on its own in advertisements or animations or whatever. You just got to play a little bit of spaghetti western music, a little bit of whistling or whatever it is, or some bells clanging, and you already know where you are. I think it's just so strong that it's become indelible. You know, and there's nothing quite like it. It's very, very distinctive. You know, you can imagine. If it's an American Western, you know, you'd have to play a piece of Aaron Copland or Aaron Copland's students, Elmer Bernstein, who scored The Magnificent Seven, or Jerome Moros, another student of Aaron Copland, who did The Big Country. And there's a whole kind of tradition of American Western music, American folk tunes pumped up to symphonic proportions and given the kind of the full orchestra treatment, like the main theme from The Big Country. Now, it just doesn't quite have it, I don't think. That you play a few bars of that, it doesn't evoke the kind of world that the Ecstasy of Gold or the Triello evoke. It's still very, very strong and global. And that's the key thing as well. That remember, Italian films not just went west, but they went east in the 1960s. So were as popular in India, the continent of Africa, in China, as they were in America and Europe. And so I think Morricone is a kind of global brand. You know, in Japan, they call them macaroni westerns rather than spaghetti westerns. And I thought they were just mispronouncing Morricone, but actually it's their version of spaghetti. Yeah, macaroni westerns.
Well, Morricone westerns. Well, I guess that might be that's actually a good seg into my next question. It's always interesting to me and kind of sad when someone who's really in the top tier of a genre rejects that genre. And I was stunned to read that Morricone hated the term spaghetti western so strongly that when Tarantino sent him the script for Inglourious Bastards, Ennio saw a stage direction, not even a line of dialogue, just a little note in the script that says, "This is a spaghetti western moment." And on that basis alone, he rejected the script and sent it back.
Yeah.
What was the reason for this antipathy, and how did he classify those westerns by Leone, if not spaghetti western?
Yeah. No, it's absolutely true. Whenever you did an interview with Morricone, which I did several times, the interpreter would say beforehand, 2 rules. 1, don't ask him what his favorite movie is. And 2, do not mention the phrase spaghetti western. Don't mention the spaghetti, because he will stop the interview there and then. And I remember when I did an interview with Leone in 1982, around about then, 82, 83, he said to me, "What does this spaghetti western phrase mean? Is it something to do with bits of spaghetti being like a lasso?" And I said, "No, you're taking this much too literally. It just means Italian, you know." But in the 1960s, we were beginning to learn about Italian food for the first time, and there was a chain of restaurants called Spaghetti House. You know, today it would be pizza, but in those days, Spaghetti House. And so spaghetti meant cheerful, cheap, and Italian. And we like it. You know, it's a compliment. It's supposed to be a term of endearment. But he didn't see it like this. Leone thought it was a put down and that it was something to do with lassos made of spaghetti. Morricone thought that spaghetti western phrase was associated with the bottom end of the movie market. Assembly line, cheap, movies made in one of the studios in Rome with very little location work, made for tuppence, with not very big stars, for a quick hit and run, B movies or Z movies, that kind of thing. And for some reason, he associated the phrase with that. And he also said, spaghetti is something you eat. It's not something you listen to. And so I thought that was a put down. And in fact, I've had quite a lot of trouble whenever I've been to conferences, because I did a book called Spaghetti Westerns in the early 1980s and helped to popularize the phrase in a big way. And whenever I went to conferences, people would say, I think it's racist. I said, I wasn't aware that spaghetti was a race, but there we are. Maybe, it takes two to tango. But they would really thought it was a put down. They preferred Western all'italiana or I hate it, Euro-Western, which sounds like a sort of pudding, with a bit of everything in it. But Western all'italiana. And it was this idea that somehow it was denigrata. It denigrated things. It was associated with a rock gut form of cinema, with Z cinema. But he never associated Leone with that. Leone, he said, is the cinema of myth, the cinema of legend. It's a very different thing he thought, to the spaghetti Western. And I once put to him that there were other Westerns that he'd scored. For me, one of my favorite non-Leone Westerns is The Big Silence by Sergio Corbucci with Jean-Louis Trintignant and Klaus Kinski. Kinski is the baddie, a bounty hunter. And I think the score is absolutely magnificent. We said, all right, well, maybe some other, apart from Leone, weren't spaghetti Westerns. But he associated, it's very odd, it was a kind of, they're trash, they're bad, they're Z movies. It's Ed Wood minus is spaghetti Westerns. He was very, very sensitive about it. The other thing he was sensitive about was being photographed at a keyboard. Now, you mentioned that he orchestrated everything himself, which he did. He had this most remarkable ability to sit in his studio, and he'd have all this manuscript paper in front of him for all the instruments of the orchestra. And out of his head, without any reference to a keyboard, he would actually score and orchestrate at the same time his themes. He saw orchestration and composition as part of a continuum. And when he was photographed at a keyboard, it created the impression that he needed a keyboard in order to compose. And he resented that. So rule number 3, don't photograph me sitting at a keyboard. He was very sensitive about things like that. But I disagreed with him about spaghetti Westerns. I think, there's some great movies by Corbucci, Sergio Sollima, Giulio Questi. I don't know, I could name lots and lots of names of people who made Westerns. And indeed, Tarantino rates Corbucci, if anything, more highly than Leone in some respects. Some of Corbucci's films, or so he always says. Again, I don't quite agree with that, but they're quite distinguished movies. But Morricone cast them into they're spaghetti Westerns. I don't score Z movies. I score proper movies. I score film d'autore, films of authors, films with directors. I think they're all film. I never liked that distinction between genre films and authored films. I think you can, John Ford made genre films. He made Westerns, but he's a great author. You could be both. You can take a genre like the Western or horror and make it your own. And in that process, you become an author. So I don't see the distinction. He did. They're author films or they're genre films. And spaghetti Westerns were the lowest form of genre film.
Well, there's a couple of things I want to circle back to there about assembly lines and Euro Westerns, but I wanted to ask you one more thing about Morricone. He said to you that he was influenced by John Cage and Gregorian chants. Yes, and I wondered if you could just briefly talk us through how that showed up in his compositions.
Well, John Cage, Morricone went to a seminar run by John Cage in Darmstadt, in Germany, in 1958. And it taught him that you can use any sounds in music, and the change of context turns them into music. And the famous experiment of John Cage, where he sat in a concert hall with a silent piece of music, and the music became the coughing and the people rustling their programs and shuffling their feet, and the noise of the audience became the music in that context of the concert hall. And Morricone was part of an experimental music group called Nuova Consonanza in Rome in the 1960s, which took John Cage's experiments with natural sounds, with silences, long silences, and so on, sounds isolated from their usual use and turned into music. So when you look at the music, even of A Fistful of Dollars, there, as you say, anvils, whip cracks, bells, male choruses, thunderous drums. It's a kind of mix of very unusual instrumentation with this traditional theme. And I think I got him to agree. First of all, he said, no, there's no connection between my musical experiments and my film scores. It's a different world. My experiments are absolute music, and my film scores are relative music. They're commissioned music. You know, they're music for a purpose. But then I'd say to him, well, what about the opening scene of Once Upon a Time in the West, where you've got all those natural sounds, the windmill creaking because it needs oiling, the fly buzzing, the water dripping on Woody Strode's head, the door creaking, the telegraph. It's a kind of symphony of naturals. He said, all right, then, I'll give you that one. It was basically influenced by John Cage and those thoughts about natural sounds. And he told me this very good story about he went to a concert and they were sitting, waiting. The Nuova Consonanza, his group were in the first half. And in the second half of the concert, they're all waiting after the interval. And nothing happened. And a man arrived with a metal ladder. And he brought the metal ladder in and he climbed up, in the auditorium with a microphone held very close to the ladder. So you got all these squeaking noises as his shoes went up this metal ladder. And everyone's getting very restive. When the hell is the second half of the concert going to begin? And suddenly they realized that this performance with the ladder was the concert. That, that the noises of this metal ladder and this heavy amplification and that this was the concert. And they all got very upset at that point. They were, God, I paid good money for a concert. All I'm doing is watching a ladder. That night, Morricone phoned Leone and said, why don't we do that with the opening sequence of Once Upon a Time in the West? And that's exactly what they did. Up till then, they were going to have a theme, a musical theme. But that concert persuaded them, let's have these amplified natural sounds out of context and just, construct them, because it's post-synchronized. You can do all that. You can layer all the sound, do all the sound design after the movie's been shot. And that's what they did. And I think it's the most wonderful sort of performance. Gregorian chant, well, Leone always said that his favorite form of music was Gregorian chant. Choral, a lot of his work is choral. Simple melody to start with in plain song, just the melody. And then in comes harmony a little bit later. And so you've got a complex arrangement of a simple melody, which is very much his thing. And he also related Gregorian chant to really the origins of music. He said, he once said to me, you start with the ancient Greeks, or probably even earlier than that. You go to the Hebrews, you go to the Romans, you go to the medieval troubadours, you go to the monasteries in the Middle Ages, and music is developing towards Gregorian chant. Then it gets exported to Celtic music in Ireland, to the music of black slaves in the United States. And you can see that Gregorian chant is a kind of crossroads in the history of music between ancient music and folk music and melodies of all different kinds. And he was very persuasive about that. It's one reason why The Mission was one of his favorite scores, because that really is about sacred music and, music on the one hand as a kind of spiritual uplift and on the other hand as a means of colonial repression. And the movie actually ends with a broken violin floating down the river. In one sense, The Mission is all about music. And whenever he was talking about his love of Gregorian chant, he would segue into talking about The Mission. And then I made the mistake of saying, well, I think you should have won the Oscar. And he sort of grimaced. It was quite clear he did too, but he wasn't going to say so. I think he was quite upset about that. But Gregorian chant is quite interesting. And choral, you mentioned choral earlier. The use of the human voice in Morricone's music is very, very distinctive. Whether it's the soprano, Edda del Orso, those soaring soprano in the Ecstasy of Gold, or a lot of his climaxes from For a Few Dollars More onwards, or whether it's the chorus of men, quick, get back, we can fight, this sort of thing. In fact, I think about a fifth of all Morricone's scores, and that's saying something, had choral music in them in one form or another. And he always treated the human voice as yet another musical instrument, the body as a new, that it doesn't necessarily have to have words, it's just a melody line taken by the voice. It's another instrument of the orchestra. And that's, for him, went back to Gregorian chant. It's an interesting connection.
Yeah, there are some modern bands that follow that same principle of the voice as instrument. Sigur Rós, Björk, Dead Can Dance, Cocteau Twins.
Movies like Troy and Gladiator, all those wailing women, you get in those ancient movies. Hans Zimmer, a lot of the human voice with electronic music. That all starts in Morricone.
Yeah, Hans Zimmer is brilliant as well, but that's a conversation for another time.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So I wanted to talk about how the pacing of films has changed over the decades. As people's attention spans decreased, we started to see more fast cuts, more action, and fewer lengthy shots, and a lot less silence. And with Leone's use of these long stare downs and establishing shots and quiet sequences that really build tension rather than cutting to the chase, do you think there's an obstacle to modern viewers appreciating his films? Or are those things really more of a welcome counterpoint to contemporary filmmaking?
Well, when The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly came out, people complained there were too many cuts in the duel scene, because as the music builds up, you get these, hands, eyes, guns, pieces of the anatomy of the three protagonists, and the cutting gets faster as the rhythm gets faster, and so on. I think, yes, it is a different aesthetic, but I think one thing made a big impact on action cinema from Leone's cinema, and that's the way he stretches time. So if you take the duel at the end of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, in real life, it would have taken about 20 seconds, right? They all get into position and they try and shoot each other. But he stretches it in order to create this suspense and this sequence. So it's a kind of cinematic time. It works in the movies, but it's not necessarily the passage of time of real life. A little bit like the opening of Once Upon a Time in the West. He's stretching time to make it last long. And I think you get that a lot in action sequences post the 1960s, whereas the rest of the movie feels like it's in real time, something happens in the heist or in the car chase where the whole notion of time changes, and you kind of submerge any feelings of realism about how these things would really have worked out into this form of cinema. You go with it. You go with the music and the image, even if it takes 3 times as long as it would in everyday life. And I think that's the impact. Of course, the other great impact on action cinema is the action hero, as a kind of style statement rather than as a crusader. That's very much, what with James Bond and The Man with No Name appearing at the same time, even James Bond worked for Queen and Country. Whereas The Man with No Name is working strictly for hard cash, and he's sort of very stylish. The interplay of music and image, the use of music that we've described, the kind of films about other films. So you make lots of knowing references to other films, so you don't pretend this movie is about the real world. When I was researching an exhibition a few years ago, and I found Leone's passport. His passport for the 1960s. He had never been to America when he made A Fistful of Dollars. The first time he went to America was just after that, when he was setting up for a few dollars more. So his knowledge of the Wild West was entirely from movies. And so, these films are about other movies. They're not about the real world. And whereas John Ford and Henry Hathaway and Howard Hawks presented themselves as we're pioneers out there in Monument Valley, we're living the pioneer, we're the first generation or second generation immigrants, and we're like the pioneer. Leone said, no, I got it all from the movies. And films about films suddenly became much more permissible, I think, after Leone. And so the people you're describing, the fast Indiana Jones, whatever it is, very fast cutting movies, they too are films about films. And I think that begins with the Italian Western, that it's a form of cinema which makes sense in relation to other films, not in relation to the real world anymore.
I think that's an interesting point that a lot of people don't realize is these iconic American Westerns, some of them, about the Civil War and whatnot, a lot of them were shot in Spain because it was I believe that's the only desert in Europe, is it not?
Yeah. Well, it's changed a bit. In those days, you could go, they had these ramblas, they were called, which are sort of canyons, where you could place the camera and the horses could hurtle by, and you had 360 degrees around it. And you could place some cactuses around and palm trees, and you have a wonderful time. Now, unfortunately, a lot of that landscape is under polythene sheeting because they want an extra crop of olives each year. So it's commercial farming. I don't think there's many of those locations where you could do a 360 anymore, that just out of frame is a bloody great sheet of polythene, and so that wouldn't be quite the thing. But I know it was the desert, and you had to send the rushes, the dailies, to Madrid to get them processed, because there was no way of processing them in Almeria, down there in the south of Spain. There was nothing, and it must have been quite something. I mean, I know you've been there, I've been there as well. And if you go to Tabernas, the town, there's a street called Cinema Street, where there used to be 7 cinemas in the heyday of the 1960s, where they'd watch the rushes when they came back from Madrid, or they'd watch the rough cut and have a great time. And of course, they're now all derelict. It's like a Leone town. Going through the cinemas. The wagons left town, unfortunately, but it was extraordinary at that time. In fact, Ken Russell, the British filmmaker, used to tell a very funny story. He was making a film about Nijinsky, and he shot part of it in Almeria. And he had this shot of, I don't know, people in the foreground with Rudolf Nureyev and other people. And he, in the background, he could see on a sand dune, there was a tractor. So you got this black dot in the distance, which rather annoyed him. So he said to the production runner, "Look, go over there, will you, and persuade him to stop doing what he's doing." And so the chap ran off and spoke to the tractor driver and came back again. He said, "Well, he'll stop, but he wants a few pesetas. Fine. Here's a few notes. Tell him to stop working." So the runner goes off and the tractor disappears, and they line up the shot and they're just about to film it. 20 tractors come over the hill. The words got round. The words got round that this is the way to make a few bob. But as Ken Russell pointed out, the other side of the sand dune, they're making a Western. And the other side of that sand dune, they're making a Jungle Jim movie, It's all happening at the same time. That must have been quite a time in the late 60s. It was the European location if you want to look like the wilderness.
And well, I want to talk to you about one of those very special locations. I am wearing a very special T-shirt for this interview rather than a collared shirt. This is my official Sad Hill Cemetery T-shirt, and so this is such a great story. Some of the people from the town, spaghetti Western fans in Spain, they discovered this film set, the cemetery from the ending of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, Sad Hill Cemetery. And a crew of volunteers, which began to grow as the project went along, worked to restore it. And when they had finally restored this cemetery to its original film set state, it never was a real cemetery, but they'd restored it to the film state, and they had a screening of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly right there in Sad Hill Cemetery. And somebody made a documentary about the whole thing. And so just before the screening of the movie in Sad Hill Cemetery, someone surprised all these volunteers by playing a video message from Clint Eastwood congratulating them for all their hard work. And I'll be honest with you, I got a little misty during that scene. I teared up a bit. And I'm curious as to what, because you're in this documentary about the making of how they restored it. So I'd like to know what your reaction was the first time you heard about this grand idea, and if you've ever been there since they've restored it.
I was there when they showed the Clint Eastwood clip. It was not a dry eye, and it was amazing. I mean, I was quite involved in this documentary, and I'd been interviewed in London and given them some ideas about the making of that sequence in the cemetery. And they decided to extend the documentary from being about the restoration of the cemetery to being about the making of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly as well. So I was invited to the to see this screening of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly in Sad Hill. And suddenly this image came up of Clint Eastwood, and of course, a loud cheer, everyone burst into tears, and he sat there and said what a great time he'd had making the movie in 1966, and that he finished up by saying very sweetly, "I may come back someday." And of course, the entire place, I'm sure that he won't, but it was very sweet of him to say that. This is a tiny village called Salas de los Infantes, near Burgos in northern Spain. And it's the best thing that ever happened to this village. The wagons arrived in the form of a film crew when making The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And they made the duel scene there. They made the concentration camp, in the Civil War, Betterville, on the hill overlooking that valley. Just down the road is the valley with the bridge for the Battle of the Bridge. All these things were made within 3 square miles of this cemetery. And it was the greatest moment in the history of this village. And they've hung on to it as an idea. So they decided to restore the cemetery to its former glory. And they did it by, you can sponsor a grave, slightly macabre, but you choose your spot and your wooden cross, and you can either go over yourself or they'll paint it for you. I have a grave, it's actually quite near, one with Tarantino written on it, I'm pleased to say, in Sad Hill Cemetery. So the names aren't quite the same as in the movie, although there is an unknown and there is an Arch Stanton, and there's 1 or 2 others from the film, of course, but the others are all sponsors. So for a few euros, you can sponsor a grave, and there's more and more. And the entire local community came with spades and buckets, and they dug all the graves, they cleared the undergrowth. It was the most amazing mobilization of an entire village. And it was an example of an audience taking over the movie, that they want to make the movie their own. They want to hang on to that movie experience. It was so intense. And so they've restored it so it's theirs again. And it's a wonderful thing. It's like the way in which people dress up or write their own versions of stories on the web. They're making it their own, and it's a very modern thing to be happening. I found it profoundly moving, actually. They've all done a lot of work, and it looks wonderful. If ever you're in Spain, if ever you're in Burgos, just get a taxi from Burgos, go to Salas de los Infantes, and wander around. Have a CD player or an MP3 player with you, and put on that track and wander around Sad Hill. Honestly, a great experience.
I mean, I would go to Spain just to go to Sad Hill. So,
there should be a grave, and I mean this in the nicest possible way. There should be a grave with your name on it.
If I can sponsor one, then I know what I'm doing when we finish with our interview.
Oh, so very good. It was wonderful, and also they had a local brass band playing Morricone's greatest hits in the middle of the cemetery. And it was like a Fellini movie. They were slightly out of tune. It was lovely. It was perfect. Like one of those Fellini bands,
Well, I could spend the rest of our time asking you questions about Westerns, but I've promised that we'll also delve into some horror. But before we jump into horror, a lot of our viewers are fans of the movie Metropolis, so I wanted to ask you a question about that. You wrote a book called Mad, Bad, and Dangerous, The Scientist and the Cinema. And in that book, you said that Rotvang from Metropolis is, quote, the most influential scientist in the history of cinema. I wondered if you could elaborate on that briefly and give us your opinion on the current depiction of scientists in film.
Wow, big one. There had been mad scientists before. There'd been Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. There'd been all sorts of things in silent cinema. But he, in the mid-1920s, became the archetypal evil genius, the mad scientist who is at the heart of the running of the modern city. And whereas the modern city looks a bit like modern New York, it's skyscrapers and walkways and helicopters and aeroplanes and so on, he lives in a Gothic house and dresses in a medieval jerkin, and he has one black glove, which is the result of some experiment that's gone wrong. He's got hair out here, and everything about him spells this guy is very strange. And he's the evil genius who's been responsible for the robots and the roboticization of the workforce in Metropolis. And so, the people's anxieties about science, which are embodied in these films, may change, but the iconography of the mad scientist has remained remarkably constant. In the 1920s, people were very worried about chemistry because of poison gas in the First World War. In the 1930s, they were worried about medicine. In the 1950s, they were worried about nuclear physics. And today, of course, they're worried about bioengineering, genetic engineering. So that's what films play to. But across those ages, look at Dr. Strangelove with his one black glove. That's a straight reference to Rotvang. And look at the fact that they tend to exist, you know, they work on their own, not in teams. They don't fill in research applications. They don't work with an organization that orthodox science is out there, but these people are burrowing away by themselves, coming up with some amazing thing that looks as though it might be of humanitarian interest, but actually their warped mind turns it into something that's going to be evil. And that all begins with Rotwang. So I do think that he was a really important figure in the history of cinema. Today, as I say, genetic engineering, I mean, someone said about Frankenstein that, you know, forget about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, that Frankenstein is now the real creation myth, because it's about artificial intelligence, the creation of an artificial creature. It's about bioengineering. It's about three-parent families. It's about animal-human interfaces. It's about a whole series of things in biology that make us very anxious today. And so, you know, movies about bad science, whether they're animations or comics or superhero comics or whatever, tend to play to that anxiety today. So the science has changed, but Rotwang lives.
Well, let's talk about Frankenstein. You wrote about how the novel came about as part of a ghost story contest that Byron and Shelley were participants in. And 4 years before that, Byron said in a speech before the House of Lords that, quote, "We must not allow mankind to be sacrificed to improvements in mechanism."
Yeah.
And both of them were keen participants in the Romantic movement, which in part extolled the virtues of the natural world and man's heroism. They were also witnessing the advance of the Industrial Revolution, which was producing machines that could take a man's job or dozens of men's jobs. So I'm curious if you see Frankenstein as a repudiation of the advance of technology, or is it a hopeful statement that maybe science doesn't have it quite right just yet, but there's better things on the horizon?
Well, in the movies, it was the former. I mean, when Hollywood ran with Frankenstein in 1931, it became, I think, an all-out critique of mad science and tampering with things we shouldn't, and nature has been offended, and you know, you're playing God, and that is sacrilegious, and you're going to get it, like Icarus or Prometheus or all these great myths of people who overreach. That's the movies, how they started. But in the original novel, this gets a bit complicated. In the first version of the novel, published in 1818 in 3 volumes by Mary Shelley, it is actually more pro-science than in the 1831 version, where she did a cut down for a popular edition, which became much more of a bestseller. So the 1818 edition is much more nuanced. You know, you get a lot of detail on young Frankenstein's, Victor Frankenstein's scientific education. It's the first novel ever written about the education of a scientist. And you go through his curriculum and how he ended up being interested in the kind of spare parts surgery that he was interested in by the time he finished. And then you get the story, and then at the end, you get the creature, you know, chasing the scientists to the Arctic wastes. And Frankenstein says to the sailor that's found him, "Other scientists will come along and stand on my shoulders. And I got things wrong, but I think eventually they're going to get things right." And there's a kind of nuance about this. May be a morality tale about a scientist who became a monomaniac, he became obsessed, and he lost any sense of proportion. But actually, the science and the progress will never stop. But I think that's rather lost. And I love the movie version, the Karloff and Colin Clive, but that gets rather lost where that's a complicated thought. And there's lots of other complicated thoughts. I mean, the fact that the creature is not really ugly. You know, there's a famous passage where just after he wakes up and his eye opens, a young Frankenstein, who, by the way, is a young research student, you know, he's in his early 20s in the book, says, you know, "Beautiful, great God, I'd chosen his parts with great care. I'd chosen his limbs, his chest, his body. He's the perfect man in the way I've sewn him together. But there's something about him when you look at him that doesn't quite add up. And it's what's going on behind his eyes is the problem." And so he becomes more and more ugly the more people treat him as ugly. In other words, if you treat people badly, they're liable to react badly. And that's quite a subtle idea. When they were converting it for Hollywood, it's much simpler to say, let's make him a monster from the word go. And give him a big cranium and a bolt in his neck and food good, smoke good, and all that sort of. That's one volume of the novel out of the way in 10 seconds. So if you read the original, particularly the 1818 version, which has been reprinted recently, it's much more subtle. She's worried, she's apprehensive about the way science can go. She's apprehensive about her husband Shelley and some of his poetry, and apprehensive about Byron, who seems to be overdoing it. She's worried that they're taking things a bit too far, but at the same time, there's important things going on in science and technology, and there's no point in trying to wish them away. And that's a much more subtle punchline, I think, than the one that we've got used to.
It sounds so. I might have to circle back to that 1818 volume. I want to talk about the book Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu, because I don't think it's been given the full measure of respect it deserves as queer literature. My impression was that the lesbianism in the book was not designed to titillate or scandalize, and what seemed more remarkable, given the culture at the time, was that it also wasn't depicted as something negative or shameful. What's your take on that specific aspect of the book?
Well, I think I agree with you that Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, who wrote it, is a much underrated figure. People write endless biographies of Bram Stoker, but Le Fanu was really fascinating. He was a recluse after his wife died. He pulled up the drawbridge and lived by himself. He wrote only at night with copious quantities of tea to keep himself awake. He was an ex-newspaper editor of the Dublin Evening Mail. He was a trained lawyer who'd been called to the bar. And he was a very, very sensitive analyst of human relationships. He used Gothic fiction not necessarily to scare people, but to examine relationships. And I think Carmilla's a very good example of that. So although it doesn't titillate, and he's an Anglo-Irish, a member of the Anglo-Irish ascendancy, and he'd be terribly upset if he thought he was accused of an exploitative lesbian story. But I want to read you a tiny bit of it to give you an idea of how sensitive. This is from chapter 4 of Carmilla. It's written by Laura, who is the victim, this rather self-possessed girl who writes the story and talks about the very beautiful Carmilla who's come to stay. She used to place her pretty arms about my neck, draw me to her, and laying her cheek to mine, murmur with her lips near my ear, "Dearest, your little heart is wounded. Think me not cruel, because I obey the irresistible law of my strength and weakness. Your dear heart is wounded, my wild heart bleeds with yours. In the rapture of my enormous humiliation, I live in your warm life, and you shall die, sweetly die, into mine." I mean, it's an extraordinary prose about a sort of dominance-dependence relationship. This countess, this aristocrat, moved into the home of this rather naive but very self-possessed girl, and she's a kind of psychic sponge who's taking over the very soul of this girl, Laura. And the description of that relationship is, more subtle than Bram Stoker, I think. And it's obviously what interested Sheridan Le Fanu. So it doesn't go for, unlike the movie versions, like The Vampire Lovers and so on, where the various versions of Carmilla, where they tend to go for usually made by male directors. So the vampire and the victim both get their kit off, and it all turns into a kind of nudie movie. It's not like that at all. It's about that moment of realization that you're being completely submerged by the will of someone else, and you either fight it or you go with it. And there's a kind of liberation with going with it, that it's very attractive. Maybe I'll become a sensual whole person for the first time instead of a prim Victorian miss. Very subtle. It's a wonderful story. And I feel very guilty, actually, because I did a couple of anthologies of Victorian vampire stories. And because Carmilla is a very long story, I didn't include it in the anthology. And one of the reviewers in one of the books said, I should have done, and he's right. I should have done. It's a key book, and he belonged to the same world as Bram Stoker. They're both in the Anglo-Irish aristocracy. Stoker wrote theatre reviews for the Dublin Evening Mail, which was the paper that Le Fanu had edited. They both went to Trinity College Dublin. They both published in Trinity College's magazine. In fact, Carmilla was first published in the Trinity College magazine, The Dark Blue. before it appeared in his collection, In a Glass Darkly. So they belong to the same world, and they're two sides of a coin. It should be read side by side with Dracula. It's a great story, but not I think, exploitative. That's not the point.
No, I didn't feel that either, which was part of what made it so remarkable to me. I have a guest question for you. This question comes to us from our friend Ed at the Rosenbach Museum, which is home to some unique artifacts and exhibits on Dracula and Frankenstein. They're just finishing up a Sundays with Dracula series that you took part in, and Sundays with Frankenstein is coming next. You can find the information at rosenbach.org, and that's ROSENBACH.org. And so here's Ed's question. We were just talking about a work not receiving its due, and Ed asks, would you like to point out a vampire story in any format, from poem to play, that you feel should be better known?
I can think of two that should be better known. One, an opera written in the mid-1820s called De Vampyr, Vampyr, at the height of the craze caused by the publication of John William Polidori's The Vampire, the Byronic, the Lord Byron style vampire. It's a novel. It's an opera by Marschner and Volbruck. It is never performed. The lead character is Lord Ruthven, the vampire, and co-starring his victim, Aubrey. The music is wonderful. People write about the Gothic novel, and there's been a bit of research about the Gothic in the way that it went into the visual arts, paintings like Fuseli's painting The Nightmare and so on. But nobody has written about the impact of the Gothic on music. And here's this opera that's hugely popular. Wagner was very influenced by it, actually took part in it. And there's one called Der Freischütz, called The Marksman, composed by Weber in 1821, which is in a similar vein. So I think there is a recording made in 1951 of The Vampire that's available on CD. At least I've got a copy of it. And it's well worth a listen. And someone should persuade an opera house to put on maybe De Vampyr, and in a double bill with a modern opera about Frankenstein. That's my number one. My number two is a story written by the great Angela Carter, who wrote a collection of stories called The Bloody Chamber in the late 1970s. And one of her stories is called The Lady of the House of Love. And I have a very particular relationship with this story because I went to Transylvania and the Carpathian Mountains in 1974 on a fact-finding mission all about vampires. And I was very friendly with Angela. We both lived in Bath. And she was very tickled with the thought of this young public school chap, as I then was, wandering around the Carpathians all by myself, hunting vampires. So she wrote this story called The Lady of the House of Love, which is all about a young man who goes on a cycling trip in the Carpathians. And she meets the seductive vampire countess, and he doesn't, being terribly British and repressed, thank you very much, Angela. He doesn't know what the hell to do, but he falls for her in a big way. It's a very beautiful story, and she was highly aware of vampire movies, of vampire literature, of the tradition in the visual arts, and it's all woven into this beautifully written story called The Lady of the House of Love. So I'd recommend that as my second rather neglected piece. Another story in The Bloody Chamber is The Company of Wolves, which was made into a film, which you might have heard of. Which was a sort of Red Riding Hood meets the werewolf type movie.
So in terms of cinema, we see this transformation with the vampire. We started out with this grotesque monster in Nosferatu, and we go from that to the young, charismatic, sexually appealing rebels of the Lost Boys. In literature, we see the same kind of change, most notably with the rock star vampire Lestat. Yeah. And eventually we wind up with Twilight in literature and cinema, which made vampires attractive to even preteen females. I've seen that there have been similar efforts to rehabilitate werewolves with far less success. Yeah. But there's really no other archetypical monster that has seen the renaissance that the vampire has.
Well, I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure. I think zombies. Zombies have had a slight I know it's slightly different. You see, the thing is that what Anne Rice did in the 70s with Interview with the Vampire was give the vampire a psychology, the inner vampire, you know, seeing it from the vampire's point of view as an addict, a rather reluctant addict across the ages, and really wants to be killed because eternal life is a curse. And I always thought that zombies, you can't have an inner zombie, you know, because it's basically a shell. It's a shell. It's a body getting up, and Night of the Living Dead and Romero and all that sort of stuff. But they have had a heck of a revival, haven't they? Both on television and in the movies.
There's certainly a huge revival, but they're still grotesque monsters.
That's true. They haven't become rock stars.
I do know people that have zombie fetishes, but for the most part, I don't think the general public looks at any representation of a zombie and says, oh, I'd quite fancy a weekend with that.
That's true. Remember, of course, in the 1960s, there was a well-known rock band called The Zombies, British, which appeared in the movie Bunny Lake is Missing, Otto Preminger, a guest appearance. But yeah, no, I think you're right. And Mummies, too, is a bit, you know, it's very interesting. There was a survey done by Universal Studios in the 1930s about the audience response to their stable of horror movies, and they said, you know, vampires are romantic and attractive. Karloff is touching in a sort of pantomime way. We feel sorry for him because he's like a little child, but mummies are horrible. They're wandering around in sort of graveyard bandages. They stink to hell, and they've been dead for 2,000 years. We don't like mummies. There's nothing sexual about them. So you're right. They put vampires at the top of the tree. No one mentioned zombies at all. So that was their market research in the 1930s. And I guess for me, the classic of that was Coppola's version of Dracula, where he reversed Bram Stoker's poles of good and evil, so that the vampire became this romantic across the ages, from the Middle Ages to the present day, the last romantic. He was allowed to be romantic at a time when the rest of us find it difficult to express romantic sentiments. And Van Helsing became a crazed fundamentalist. Do you remember Anthony Hopkins in the graveyard with the cross? You know, trust in the Lord, trust in him. He was like some crazed fundamentalist driving these vampires. So liberation was vampire, repression was the fundamentalist. That's the exact opposite of Bram Stoker's polarities, but it shows how far we've come. And so, yeah, the vampire is the last romantic. I mean, I thought it was impossible to have a vegetarian vampire, I must admit, but when you read Twilight, you're edging towards a vegetarian vampire, and I don't know, something's gone wrong there. He must be a carnivore, for goodness sake. I mean, you know, that's the scary thing, isn't it?
There are many vampire fans who think that perhaps something might have gone wrong with Twilight, but we won't get into that.
I went to a Dracula dinner a few years ago, and by the Dracula Society in England, where they had the throne with Christopher Lee's cape, and we all toasted the absent guest. And I couldn't help noticing that half the people there were eating omelettes. I'm the vegetarian option. I thought, well, maybe that's what makes vampires really scary. If you're a vegetarian, there's something very, very scary about vampires.
Right. Well, Sir Christopher, you're over in Europe. You're many hours ahead of us, and you did mention that you had an engagement in the morning. Do we need to let you go, or can we keep you for a little while longer?
Let's give it about 10 minutes more till 15:15.
Okay.
Let's do that.
So your book Vampires briefly mentions this renewed interest in vampires, the books, the movies, and whatnot, watching or reading these stories. But you didn't really talk about the renewed interest in being a vampire, and whether it's somebody that's cosplaying or they're doing live action role playing for the weekend, or whether it's people who are part of the vampire subculture who live that life 24 hours a day, and you might be talking to one right now.
Indeed, I think the teeth are a clue.
That phenomenon really seems inseparable from any exploration of the history of vampires. So I'm wondering if that's something you plan to discuss in a future edition of the book.
If I did another edition, I would definitely have something on cosplay and all that. I've been to many conventions where the care that people take, whether it's teeth implants or the costumes that they wear to live out this myth of the vampire is quite extraordinary. In fact, the Borough Council of Whitby in Yorkshire And if you remember in Dracula, when Dracula arrives in England, he arrives in a deserted ship that runs aground in Whitby and goes up to the graveyard and so on. And as a result of that, Whitby has become the goth capital of the United Kingdom, where people dress up and have parties, have a wonderful time. And
Whitby Gothic Weekend is quite famous.
Yeah, exactly. So I got a letter from the local borough council saying, is this a good thing or is it really bad for Whitby to be the goth capital of the UK? Tell us about this. I wrote back saying, it's great. It's great. It's a niche that you want to fill. I mean, it makes Whitby very, very special to be the goth capital of the UK. Go with it, you know, exploit it. Have hotels which cater for that kind of visitor, or restaurants that cater for, have tours of the graveyard, you know, do all that. For goodness sake, don't be squeamish about it. They were worried it was bad for their image and might put off the paying customers. I said the opposite. Be the goth capital. And I was there once for one of their gatherings, and it was wonderful.
Yeah.
All these ladies with kohl around their eyes and tight bodices and teeth. You're nodding in a very knowing way. And lots of black lace. And it was amazing, actually. And I felt a bit out of place because I was in a blazer and a tie and looking terribly British. And no one actually came up to me and said, you know, what have you come as? I'd come as myself, but maybe next time. But no, and there was talk at London's Victoria and Albert Museum a couple of years ago, and I hope that it survived COVID, of a major exhibition on cosplay as a phenomenon. And how important it's become in design, and as well as people making stories their own, and all sorts of, you know, complicated things are going on with cosplay. And that would be great to have a really major national exhibition on cosplay. Yes, I would certainly put in a chapter about it in any future edition. It's really important. And it's sort of happened, well, it had happened quite a while ago. I don't know how long you've been on this, but it's only
25 years.
Right. Well, it's in the last 10 years, I think, that it's really taken off in a big way. And it is quite extraordinary. I wish I'd had a camera with me. I went to one of these cosplay events in the north of England, and I went outside for a breath of fresh air before I gave a talk. And there was a taxi arriving, and a man got out of the taxi one side with an axe stuck in his head. And on the other side was a lady, all black lace and pale makeup and kohl, and a baby in a pram with teeth. And the taxi driver wasn't taking a blind bit of notice. This happens every day. I just thought it would make a wonderful photograph with the taxi driver saying, you know, that'll be £5, mate, you know. I love that. We're used to it. We're used to it.
Yeah, in Whitby they certainly would be. So on a completely non-horror related subject, generally, when I go to bed at night, there's two things I like to watch. One is any program by James Burke from the BBC, and the other is lots of different types of documentaries. I like Ken Burns movies, but I'm also very fond of a little series from England called The World at War, which was brilliantly narrated by Sir Laurence Olivier and was rated the top documentary in British television by the British Film Institute. Yeah. Tell us about your role in that amazing series.
It was fairly tiny. I worked at the Imperial War Museum at that time in the early 70s in London as a film researcher and a film archivist. One of my first jobs after leaving college. And the great thing was to find color footage. You know, the BBC Two, which is a channel in England, had launched itself with a series called The Great War, which is all about the First World War. So everything was in monochrome, in black and white. And Thames Television wanted to do something that was one step better, which was color. And so there wasn't much official color footage of the Second World War. Most official war footage was black and white. So we got in touch with local newspapers across Europe and placed small ads in these newspapers and said, has anyone got any cine film that your fathers or grandfathers took in color, film buffs, cine buffs, filmed during the 1930s and during the Second World War. And all this footage came in on 8mm, 8.5mm, 16mm, all sorts of different formats. And we had to put that aside and decide which of these bits of color footage would be used. Some of it was used in the program. And part of my job was to sift through some of this material. But there was an army of film researchers. I wouldn't claim that my role in this was particularly significant, but it was a landmark series. I mean, it was it was not only the footage, finding all this colour footage and the Eastern European film archives, but also witnesses were still alive. I mean, the people who were talking had been there on both sides, you know.
Right, and that was one of the fascinating things to me, was you had people from Germany, you had people from Japan, you had people, you know, people who were on the other side of the war giving their perspective, which you tell me, but I would hazard a guess that was probably the first time that had been done in a war documentary.
Well, we'd done it with they did it with The World at War, where there were still a few veterans of the First World War. That was in the early to mid 1960s. And what they did was they simultaneously recorded them for the series, but also recorded their audio interviews for the archive at the War Museum. So there's a huge archive of First World War oral history, which is a spin-off from the Great War series. And they did a little bit of the same thing with The World at War, that if you're going to find these people and talk to them, you may only use them for 5 minutes in the show, but you can sit down with them for a couple of hours and have a really in-depth interview with them and put it into the archive. So it had a spin-off into the oral history. It was great fun working in the War Museum. And I found all sorts of things. I found a film made by Alfred Hitchcock for the Free French called Bon Voyage that was lying in a rusting tin in the film archive. A Walt Disney film called Victory Through Air Power, which is a partly animated feature from the team that gave you Snow White, in favor of the obliteration bombing of Germany. I mean, it's extraordinary stuff. So yes, it's a very, very rich archive. And The World at War was a great series. And I think there were 2 British TV series, one on Colditz and one called Dad's Army, which is all about the Home Guard in the Second World War, and those were the exhibitions that were on at the time when The World at War was on television. So I was involved in those as well. But I wouldn't like to claim that my stamp is on this series at all. I was a very minor cog, but it was a wonderful way to cut your teeth as a film researcher.
Absolutely, I'm sure that must have been endlessly fun for you and fascinating.
Actually, a lot of the films on nitrate stock, which is combustible, and we were all shown a Royal Air Force film about what happens when one of these reels of film goes up, and basically a wall of flame goes sideways from the projector, and you better get out of the way, or otherwise it'll take your face with it. We were shown this before we started dealing with nitrate film. We threaded it up on a Moviola, a Steenbeck machine, and I catalogued a lot of nitrate material, and I had no trouble with it except just once. There was a can of film, I think it was marked U-boat footage. And I thought, oh, that looks interesting. So I did it, and it was just brown jelly. And it went bloop, like this, and bubble appeared. I thought, oh my God. So I tipped it into a bucket of chemicals.
Oh dear.
Steam came out of it. And I thought, no one's ever going to see that movie. But it had gone. It was just brown jelly. There was nothing on it at all. But I guess if I'd let air come into it for too long, I might have been in trouble. So I just threw it into a bucket of chemicals. That's the only time I had trouble with nitrate. So you're living dangerously when you're a film researcher sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, you could have wound up looking like Nosferatu, so that would have been bad. I know you've answered this question a million times, but this is going to be new to some of our viewers. So I'm going to ask you to explain your motto for your coat of arms. Can you tell us what it is in Latin and in English, please?
When you become a knight in England, which I did in the year 2000, you have to choose a coat of arms, which goes back to the Middle Ages when you went into battle. These were your colours. You could tell who you were working for from your colours, and you choose a motto. And for the colours, I chose a sprocket of film, an owl, which is a symbol of history. You know, the owl of Minerva comes out at dusk. That's historians coming out and describing things at dusk. And various other references in the picture, but I had to choose my motto. So I got a scholar from Oxford to translate into Latin, and it goes, Purge scelus fecit mihi diem perficias. And I went to the heralds, and they looked at it and said, what is this? Proceed, varlet, make my day perfect. I said, well, something like that. Actually, what it is go ahead, punk, make my day. It's the only Dirty Harry, Clint Eastwood inspired motto in the history of heraldry, which goes back to the 12th century. So I've made history. Future scholars will look at this crest and they say, what the hell was he talking about? And then someone will say, well, of course, it's a reference to Dirty Harry. Yeah, no, you can't take these things too seriously. And I got my students at the Royal College of Art to work on the crest as well, and they came up with some mad ideas, to relate to my interests. On one occasion, they had punctures in the shield with blood dripping out of them, as if a vampire had bitten through it. And next to it, you have ribbons. You have a sort of helmet on the top and a bird perched on the top and ribbons down the side, and they made them into pieces of tagliatelle, bits of spaghetti, so that to make a reference to my interest in spaghetti westerns. Unfortunately, this didn't get past the heralds, and it was a bit too much to take in. I would have quite liked some drops of blood and some tagliatelle. That would have been good, but the sprocket holes do it, and a bit of Dirty Harry, and the rest you have to. Oh, in fact, I've had it carved in stone, and it is over my front door, like Castle Dracula. So as I arrive home, there's this carved thing, Purge Scelus, fecit mea diem perficias. I feel like sort of Christopher Lee swooping into a hammer castle, or Bela Lugosi tripping over an armadillo at the feet of the stairs in Todd Browning's Dracula every time I come in from the supermarket. So it's great. It does me good. And when you're knighted, you go to Buckingham Palace, and the Queen is handed this huge sword, and you get on one knee, and she puts the sword on one shoulder, and she puts the sword on the other, and she puts it on the other one again. And of course, being a movie buff, what flashed through my mind was Errol Flynn on the deck of the Golden Hind in the Seahawk, being knighted by Queen Elizabeth I, and you just hope that the Queen doesn't drop it, because it might separate your head from your throat. But no, it's an amazing moment. And then she says, "Arise, Sir Christopher." And all my staff at the Royal College did this card of me all dressed in armour, and underneath they wrote, "A rise, please, Sir Christopher." It means a raise in England, A rise, please. I thought, oh, thank you very much. Yeah. No, it's all. You can't take these things too seriously. But if ever I go into battle with my troops, I'll be recognisable by sprocket holes and a Dirty Harry motto.
Fantastic. So I'll make this my last question, since you have an engagement in the morning. I listened to an interview with you from about 2 years ago where you said that you'd really like to write the script for a feature film. Yeah. And I'm wondering if that's still a goal, and if you've made any progress on that.
Well, I'd love to. I did, in fact, write a script many years ago called Jack Slade, Desperado. And it was all about a character who's written about by Mark Twain in Roughing It. Jack Slade, a gunfighter who sort of scared everybody by, the legend said that everybody he shot, he'd cut off one of their ears and hang it on his belt, and he'd go into a saloon and flip the ear over the saloon, say whiskey, and no one dared charge him for a drink. And so that was interesting. He also was married, and his wife got him out of all sorts of scrapes. And so my script, which was largely fiction, like most Westerns, was all about Jack Slade getting into all sorts of trouble, and his wife would, in the nick of time, would rescue him by shooting through the rope he's about to be hung with, or by rescuing him from the posse or whatever it was. It would have been an early feminist Western. That was the idea for it. And a rather shady film producer from Holland mocked up a poster for this and took it to the Cannes Film Festival. And I'll never forget it. It had written on it, I wish I'd got a copy of it, but I didn't. It said Jack Slade Desperado, written by Christopher Frayling. It said John Cassavetes, asterisk, and Jane Fonda, asterisk, in Jack Slade Desperado. And at the bottom, in tiny letters, asterisk, subject to availability. And, that's the nearest I got, I'm afraid, to a movie. But no, I get ideas and I write them down sometimes. But no, I'd really love to. I'd love to. And maybe one day, who knows? A variation either on, I think the Western, it's very difficult to do a Western today. That's another story for another day, perhaps. But, the Western has changed from being a sort of genre film to becoming a costume drama. And, there aren't many people around who can wrangle horses or who know their way around Westerns anymore. And you have to, and it shows, that you see a film like Young Guns and they look like a rock band in fancy dress, in my view. You don't feel they're real Westerners. And I'd really love to get back to a proper Western that isn't ironic, that hasn't got its tongue in its cheek, that's really trying to tell it like it was, but not easy. And maybe one day, or maybe a variation on the vampire myth. Who knows? That would be great. Thanks for reminding me of that.
Well, if you decide to combine the two and do a Western vampire movie, I'm volunteering myself for a bit part or a cameo.
Yes. Oh, sorry. I should say I also did a treatment years ago called "Wanted, Dead and Alive," which was, and I only remember the final sequence, which was the priest with a crossbow, because this was his cross, shooting stakes at all these vampires in the Wild West. It was quite fun, actually, that he was a sort of Anthony Hopkins figure, brandishing this crossbow, firing ashen stakes made of holy ash wood in the direction of these vampires which were coming at him at night. It was a kind of reversal of the Native Americans going round and round the wagons. This was a sort of variation on that. Wanted, dead and alive, but it didn't get anywhere. We can but fantasize.
Well, if it comes to pass, you know how to get a hold of me, Sir Christopher.
I think a starring role.
Wow, you're too kind. You're too kind. I'll ask you to stick around for a minute after I end the broadcast, but unfortunately it is time for us to end the broadcast. So I want to say thank you again to Sir Christopher Frayling for spending some time with us, talking about a lot of interesting and fun things. I know that we've had some people asking questions in the comments. I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to the comments, but as you can see, we had a limited amount of time relative to all of the many things that Sir Christopher is qualified to speak on. So who knows, maybe we'll do another one of these in the future if he's not busy directing his screenplay. So Sir Christopher, thank you so much for your time and for being here and for sharing your stories with us and our audience. It's very much appreciated.
Well, thank you very much. And I can only say adios, amigo.
Adios. So stick around. This will be the end of the broadcast, and we'll chat for just a minute afterwards. Good night, everybody.
Night, night.